sun was sinking behind the hills as Martin, Sarah, and David arrived at the entrance of the old manufacturing plant, a place rumored to be cursed. Once the lifeblood of a small industrial town, it had stood abandoned for over 30 years, decaying as nature crept over its forgotten walls. Tall weeds sprouted from the cracked concrete, and the entire area seemed to reek of neglect. Yet, here they were, driven by curiosity and a dare that none of them could resist. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah said, hugging her jacket closer. She glanced nervously at the looming silhouette of the factory, its windows like dark, hollow eyes watching them. "That's the point," Martin said with a grin, pulling out his phone to record their adventure. "We're here to prove we're not scared of some stupid ghost stories." David stayed quiet, his eyes scanning the rusted metal doors, the broken windows, and the eerie stillness that seemed to swallow sound. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something about the factory made his skin crawl. The air felt unnaturally heavy, as if they were trespassing somewhere they didn't belong. They had heard the stories growing up, how workers had vanished without a trace, how strange noises echoed from the walls late at night, and how anyone who ventured inside never came back quite the same. The factory had closed suddenly in the 80s, and no one knew exactly why. "Let's get this over with," David finally muttered. They forced the door open with a groaning creak that seemed to echo down into the bowels of the building. Dust filled the air as they stepped inside. The first thing that hit them was the smell, damp, rot, and something else, something metallic, like old blood. The factory floor stretched out before them, a massive cavern of rusted machines and conveyor belts, all frozen in time. The ceiling was high, the rafters lost in shadow. A few shafts of dying sunlight filtered in through the broken windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. "Look at this place," Martin said, sweeping his phone's flashlight across the machines. "It's like a graveyard for machines," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she looked around. They walked deeper into the factory, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast space. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The walls seemed to close in, and the faint sounds of dripping water and distant creaks played tricks on their ears. David noticed it first, the cold. It wasn't the usual chill of an old building, it was sharp, biting. He glanced over his shoulder, suddenly aware of how far they'd come from the entrance. "Do you guys feel that?" he asked, his voice low. "Feel what?" Martin said, waving his flashlight around carelessly. "It's freezing," Sarah added, rubbing her arms. "I didn't think it was this cold outside." David didn't answer. Instead, he stopped, his heart racing as a strange sound reached his ears. It was faint, almost like whispering, but there was something wrong about it, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Did you hear that?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Martin and Sarah paused, their expressions confused. David listened again. The whispers were gone. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Maybe it was just the wind or the sound of settling metal. But then he heard it again, louder this time. A faint scratching sound, like nails on metal. It was coming from one of the machines, or at least that's what it seemed like. "Something's over there," David said, pointing toward the source. "You're just trying to scare us," Martin scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "No, I'm serious," David insisted, his heart pounding harder now. "There's something over there." Against their better judgment, they approached the rusted conveyor belts, each step heavier than the last. The air was thick with tension, and even Martin had stopped recording. As they neared the machine, the scratching noise stopped. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the factory. They all jumped, spinning around to find the source. Nothing. What the hell was that? Sarah's voice trembled. They were no longer playing. The atmosphere had changed, thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. "I think we should leave," David said firmly, backing away from the machines. "Yeah," Sarah agreed, her voice shaky. "This place doesn't feel right." Before they could turn back, something moved in the darkness at the far end of the factory. At first, it was just a shadow, quick, darting, but then they all saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing motionless just beyond the reach of their flashlights. "Who's there?" Martin called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. "Let's go," David said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't wait for the others to agree. He grabbed Sarah's arm and started to pull her back toward the entrance, his heart thudding in his chest. They moved quickly, trying not to look back. but the sound of footsteps behind them was unmistakable, soft, deliberate, and getting closer. They broke into a run, racing toward the entrance. The factory seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in, the machines like hulking beasts in the dark. The footsteps behind them were getting louder, closer, faster. Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. David didn't need to be told twice. He ran harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes locked on the door. But just as they reached the entrance, the heavy metal door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They skidded to a stop, their hearts hammering in their chests. "Open it," Martin shouted, his voice filled with terror. David threw himself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the outside. His hands shook as he pounded on the door, but it was no use. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "We're trapped in here." The factory was silent again, but the footsteps had stopped too. Slowly they turned around. The figure was gone, but the darkness felt alive, pulsating with something unseen and terrible. Then the lights flickered. A low hum filled the air as the old machines groaned to life, gears grinding, belts moving. The factory floor, once dead and silent, was now alive with the sound of whirring metal and clanking machinery. "What's happening?" Martin shouted, backing away from the machines that had suddenly come to life. "It's the factory," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's waking up." Suddenly, one of the machines let out a loud, piercing screech. From the shadows, the figure appeared again, closer this time. But it wasn't alone. More figures emerged, their shapes twisted and wrong, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "They're coming," Sarah screamed. The figures moved slowly but with purpose, their distorted forms sliding through the shadows like predators. There was nowhere to run. The door was sealed, and the factory floor was a maze of moving machinery and dark corners. "We have to hide," David yelled, dragging them toward a nearby staircase that led to the upper levels of the factory. They stumbled up the steps, their footsteps loud in the mechanical chaos below. But the figures were still following, relentless, climbing after them with unnatural speed. As they reached the top floor, they found themselves in a narrow hallway, lined with offices. The machines were louder now, their gears grinding with a deafening roar. David turned to the others, his face pale. "We need to barricade ourselves in one of these rooms." They threw themselves into an office, slamming the door shut and pushing an old desk against it. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. The figures were coming, and there was no escape. Trapped in the dark, with the factory alive and the shadowy figures closing in, they realized the truth. The factory had never been abandoned. It had simply been waiting for new workers, waiting for them. The whispers returned, filling the room, echoing in their heads. And then, the door began to open.